Transplanting things, you get an excellent jump on the weeds, sometimes 4 weeks or more. And you can also plant at the right density, so you can start to outcompete the weeds in your beds. The middle picture is of bok choy, and that was a good example for us of, we planted it extremely dense under row cover from transplants. And not only did we get this really lovely, straight, beautiful, upright crop of bok choy, but they were so dense that they outcompeted any major weeds. So there's very low weed pressure underneath the row cover. And we didn't have any flea beetles because we were using the row cover as well. So transplanting can give you a really good jump on the weeds. And once you have sort of mature plants, and they're much easier to weed around and kind of manage when those weeds start to go through their cycles through the summer. Next slide. One little side note too, if you're transplanting directly into a mulch or a low growing cover crop, just remember that you want your cover crop to be appropriate and not to outcompete your actual crop. We planted hairy vetch one time as a cover crop for weed suppression in our broccoli bed, and it was such a aggressive cover crop that it sort of started overtaking our broccoli that year, and so it's something we might consider doing differently. Irrigation is a great way to mitigate weeds on the farm. Obviously, drip irrigation is much more water efficient, but it also doesn't allow for the weeds to germinate as broad scale over the farm as overhead irrigation does. Next slide. But also know, when you're using drip irrigation and cover crop and crop rotations, you'll have to consider different strategies for irrigation, because cover crops need water often to germinate. Green manures need water to be able to be incorporated, so sometimes drip irrigation doesn't necessarily work the best when you're using different cover crops, so yeah, just consider that. Timing of cultivation in terms of weed management, I like to call it the tickle factor. So you have your soil and you have this flush of weeds just starting. They're tiny little sprouts. You want to just go and tickle that soil, whether it's with a hoop hoe or a rake, or maybe you have a tractor with some small tines that you can drag behind. But you want to do a shallow cultivation, and you want to do it when the weeds are small. And obviously, don't irrigate right after you cultivate, because you've probably brought some weed seeds to the surface, and you're just going to recreate the problem by watering them. Next slide. Get those tiny weeds first. It's so much easier. Another technique that I haven't used ever, but I have seen used on the farm elsewhere, is solarizing the soil. And that basically means to superheat the soil and kill everything underneath this plastic before you plant the bed. Just know that it does take time. It needs to be on for at least 30 days during the heat of the summer to be able to solarize a bed effectively. And so if you're planning on using solarizing as a weed suppression technique, you kind of have to do the timing and make sure it works out for your crop production. Next slide. But it does work. Some of the equipment used for weeding, I mentioned, there's tons of available equipment, but hand tools are probably the most effective ones around the farm for us. And there's also flamers and steamers and mowers and wiggle weeders and all sorts of groovy things. But do your homework and know what not is only appropriate for controlling weeds, but what you can handle in terms of labor. Next slide. Yeah, basically know your weeds. And I think the next slide talks about insect pest management. So let's move along. On the farm, when we talk about IPM, or integrated pest management, we think about insects mostly, and of course disease. Next slide. But there's different practices, and it's not necessarily easy, but it can be really, really interesting. And I think the more we think about IPM strategies on the farm, the more fun we'll have, because we don't view things as this is a good bug, this is a bad bug, this is a good flower, this is a bad flower. It's kind of all this whole living system that we get to explore and see what works the best. There's many different definitions of pest management, but basically they're strategies that minimize the economic and health and environmental risks on the farm of taking care of pests. It's an integrated approach that focuses on prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression. And if I could underline prevention 100 times, then I would. Next slide, because it's all about prevention. There's various practices that keep pests from entering the field or orchard or greenhouse or whatever you have. But basically, you need to see what you can do as a sustainable farmer and a good land steward to prevent these pests from infesting in the first place. What are we introducing to the farm? How are we managing our crops? Are we, through our lovely humanness, creating little microenvironments that encourage insect populations? For example, heat stress. Plants that are suffering from heat stress and drought conditions are much more prone to spider mite infestations. If you're using cardboard mulch in your walking rows, you're going to have earwigs, for example. So things like that we're doing on the farm are really preventative measures that we need to address. Using pest-free seed, pest-free transplants, using proper field sanitation, all of this kind of stuff. Prevention, prevention, prevention. And I think that, let's just move to the next slide. But I think that if we look at why are we trying so hard to keep things neat and tidy on the farm, we tend to eliminate diversity, and that can sort of create problems that we'll get into. Avoidance is the next principle, and I kind of think of it as, okay, the pests are here, so now what? So we want to not get out Grandpa's old can of DDT, but we want to look at what is the next strategy in our IPM program, and that is to minimize the pest impact through different cultural practices like crop rotations or crop choices or trap crops. And a good example of this is the flea beetle. They love mustards and the brassicas. They just love them. And you know, a good trap crop for flea beetles is to plant a nice, beautiful cover crop of prairie gold mustard. And the flea beetles will flourish over there, and they might do a little damage, but if you can kind of trap them over there and focus on row cover and stuff in your crop bed, then you're much more likely to mitigate that pest impact. Avoid it altogether. You can adjust your planting schedule by planting early or late, or not even planting at all, depending on the life cycle of the pests. But basically, just because a pest is present doesn't mean that it's going to be a traumatic event. Just know that there are different things, different strategies that we can do to mitigate those impacts. Next slide, please. Monitoring is one of my favorite strategies in the IPM program, because we get to walk around And I think it's the key component to any program, but it's based on knowledge. You need to know what you're dealing with. And that means get out and make the rounds. Next slide. You need to have a monitoring program, and that means getting out and looking around, taking samples, taking maybe a field lens with you, maybe a sweep net, or some farms even use this vacuum technique. Some farms trap with pheromone traps or pitfall traps, but basically you get to go out and see what's happening. You can trap to kill, but you also get to look, and I think that's the best part of it, because you get to know your pests and you get to know your beneficials that are present. Next slide, please. Finally is suppression, when gosh, we have a major problem here, and what can we do to avoid it in the future or fix it? Suppression, there's different sort of strategies involved: cultural practices, biological control, physical suppression, or chemical or biopesticide control. And I want you to try the cultural, the biological, and the physical suppression before you go for the chemical, because I think that's our duty as sustainable farmers. But basically, you can kind of integrate all of these techniques, and I think if you do this on the farm, you will have created a really good IPM plan that you're going to find that there's rise and falls of pest populations. It's unavoidable, but you will have a healthier farm to go back to at the end of the day, and you'll be a smarter farmer because of it. The chemical and biopesticide control is a last resort. We've never had to use anything on our farm, and never really would. There's no benefit ratio for us to consider to use a chemical control, but some farmers do, and that goes back to your whole farm goals. Next slide. The problems with pesticides, we call it the pesticide treadmill. It should really be called the human treadmill, because humans created it. But basically, there's resistance, resurgence, secondary pests, and residues to think about. And in terms of resistance, just remember that pesticides, they exert a powerful selection process for changing the genetic makeup of pest populations. Naturally resistant individual pests will survive the application of a pesticide. Then these guys will reproduce, and then they will survive, and then you'll reapply, and then they'll survive, and then they'll reproduce, and the cycle goes on and on and on. There's over 500 plus species of insects that are resistant to pesticides. So it's a problem that using pesticides on the farm sort of opens the door to kind of creating more and more problems. Resurgence is another sort of I guess a thing to think about when you're looking at pesticide use, because pesticides not only kill the target pest, but also tend to kill natural enemies of that pest. So when we talk about resurgence, we talk about the resurgence of the pest that can come back sometimes tenfold in numbers that were worse than what we started with, because now the natural enemies are gone, and you've created this perfect environment for this pest to thrive. Secondary pests often become a problem, because once the natural enemies are gone of the first pest, then they were the natural enemies of the second pest. So now all of a sudden you have 2 or 3 different insects or pests that you need to deal with. And of course, residues from pesticides in water and air and in humans are incredibly important to think about before you apply a pesticide. Next slide, please.